Hi, Misha here, and we're continuing our look at the A for Attack craft. Started off with the first jet, the A4, small, light, simple. Then we jumped to the A5 and the RA5C, large, heavy, and complicated. Then we went to the A7, Corsair, kind of the replacement for the A4. And now we're at, kind of going back a little bit, sort of, kind of, not really, the EA-6 Bravo Prowler. This is the electronic warfare variant or version of Grumman's famous A-6 Intruder. Yes, Flight of the Intruder. That's what pretty much comes to everyone's mind in the beginning. At least old people. I'm not really going to talk about the A-6 much in this video. I don't have a model of it at the moment, but maybe one day I'll get one, so I'll save that. I'll just quickly say that it was a much heavier attack craft than the A4. It was designed to replace the A1 Skyraider for both the U.S. Navy and Marines. It was essentially a air-to-ground attack craft that could support bombs, guided missiles, and so on and so forth. First flew in 1960. Went into production a couple of years later and into service by 1963. It was adopted by both the Marines and the Navy. Saw extensive use in Vietnam and afterwards. It was in production at Grumman and later Northrop Grumman until 1990. It was in Marine service until 1993. And the Navy finally retired the A-6 in 1997. The A-6 had a crew of 2, pilot and a navigator/bombardier. It was about 54.5 feet long, had a wingspan of 53 feet on the nose, and was capable of about 640 miles per hour. It could climb to about 42,000 feet and could mount a total of 5 bombs. I should say it has 5 hard points. So obviously some hard points could support multiple rockets or, dumb bombs, but you get the idea. Had 2 engines, and it did use the same kind of side-by-side buddy cockpit. Well, again, the A-6 Intruder was an attack bomber version. Pretty early on, though, the Marines were in desperate need of a modern electronic warfare craft. Thus was born the EA-6 Alpha, EA-6A. The EA-6A was little more than an upgraded A-6A. It still only had a crew of 2, and actually only 27 were made. About half were brand new production, half were converted from A-6s, and the Marines would fly these throughout Vietnam and through the 70s. The EA-6A wasn't a bad craft, but it was always thought to be an interim solution, kind of a stopgap measure. because in November of 1966, right as Vietnam was really getting going, the government issued a contract to Northrop, well, I guess it was still Grumman at the time, Grumman, to develop the EA-6 Bravo, the Prowler. This is based on the Intruder, and while we still have a 53 feet wingspan, we still have a total of 5 hardpoints under the wings. We have a longer fuselage. It's just a hair under 60 feet. So it's over 5 feet longer. And the majority of that is to allow a larger cockpit for a crew of 4. And the Prowler would house the pilot and 3 electronic warfare officers, ECMOs, although Wikipedia says sometimes 2 were used instead, and I could see that. But anyway, a crew of 3 to 4 total with a larger capacity. It was also specialized for its new role. It was given a new boom on the back of the tail, the big bulge, and little sticky out bits for sensors and radars. It could mount electronic jamming pods up to 5 underneath. They even had these cool little turbines so they would self-power. It also often carried HARM anti-radiation missiles, and often would of course carry fuel tanks. And this plane did a lot. It was an electronics craft, of course. It was a jammer. It could do some espionage, peeping in on the enemy's electronics. It was also a command and control, a coordination craft. They could, organize and direct an air fleet. But it was still an EA-6. It still had the attack capability. It was not a passive craft. It was primarily used to knock out radar sites, but also surface-to-air missile batteries, SAM, installations. It could still mount much of the same ordnance as the A-6. It was actually a smidge faster at about 650 miles per hour, but it had a lower ceiling of about 37,000 feet. They would build just under 700 A-6 Intruders, and they would build 170 EA-6 Prowlers. Production would begin in 1966 and continue through 1991, so the first Gulf War. The first test flight would begin in 1968, and the Navy would receive its first planes in 1971 and have them in theater in Vietnam a year later in 1972, where they would fly mini sorties. They would assist attack craft such as the A-7, as well as Air Force planes like the B-52 bombers. These were flown by the Marines and the Navy. They were never flown by the Air Force as far as I know, but they were used to support Air Force operations. And of course they were used in Vietnam. Vietnam ended. They were also used in the 80s during events like the invasion of Grenada, and they were used to jam radars over Libya in 1986, and about 40 of these were used during Operation Desert Storm, the first Gulf War in 1991. Very much in active use. So even as the A-6 was falling out of service and would be retired, the EA-6B would very much remain in service. These were extensively upgraded, really since the beginning, through the 70s and 80s. And they were a pretty fickle aircraft because of all the electronics, but they kept them running, and they were very useful because they could perform so many roles. In fact, in 1998, the Air Force would retire its EF-111 Raven, which was the electronic warfare version of the F-111 Aardvark, which we've got a video on. That left the EA-6 pretty much the only plane in all of the military that could do its very specific job. So really, if anything, in the late 90s, it became just as important. And for about a decade, it pretty much would mind the house alone. It wasn't until 2009 that it would slowly start to be phased out in favor of the new EF-18 Growler, which is an electronic warfare version of the Hornet. Therefore, it was used extensively during the Second Gulf War in Iraq. It's also used in Afghanistan, and it's been said that it was used to support the capture/elimination of Osama bin Laden. So, good on it. The Navy would start to finally phase theirs out in 2014 and wrapping it up in 2015, having a retirement ceremony. The Marines would continue flying the EA-6 for a bit longer. A short time later, they would use these in Syria. But actually, just this year, just about 2 months ago, March of 2019, the Marines finally retired the last couple of EA-6s they had. So now the EF-18 has totally taken over. It's a neat plane. I mean, it's still an attack craft. It still hasn't given up those roots, but it's pretty neat. Had a lot of electronics, but it was definitely 60s era electronics, very much like you would have seen during the Apollo program with NASA. So it had multiple computers, but there was still a lot of manual input and review, hence why we have 3 officers dedicated to just managing it. Newer planes like the EF-111 and the EF-18 just have 1 officer for the electronics. This Hobbymaster model is pretty neat. It actually has the most crewmen. Many of the ones I have. It does have 4. Has the front and rear. When I got this model out, I guess they had been jostled because when I opened up the canopy, each pilot kind of had his head in the lap of his little mate there. I'm going to hope he was taking a nap and not having an orgy, but, you know, who knows. So I had to actually go in and kind of straighten him up. That's one thing I've noticed, the pilots in these kind of just sit there, so if you jostle it, some of the Hobbymaster planes, the pilots kind of friction fit into their seats, while other ones, they just sit in there. And this tends to be more of the sit in there type. The wings and fuselage are all metal, with all the little sticky-outy bits being plastic, polymer. Of course, our electronic jamming pods under the wings are plastic, but we do have the little turbines, which is neat. This is definitely one I was excited to get, and I've had this one for quite a while. It was one of my earlier pickups. I like how it sits on the stand. It's one of the ones where the stand is made of metal, and it actually goes through the middle pod. It's got a cut out. I wish they did that with all of them, because a lot of the Hobby Master planes you have to make a decision if you want it on the stand or you want the middle device installed. So I like that on some planes like this, the F-105 Thunder Chief is the same way. And it also gives a very stable mount. In fact, getting it off when I was messing with this earlier was had to kind of pry her a little bit. It's on there good, which I like. It is a heavier plane. It's not as heavy as the RA5C we looked at, but it is pretty hefty. They don't do an A-6 Intruder, but I'm fine with this. It's probably more interesting anyway. So there we have it. Well, we'll move on with other videos on the attack craft. Appreciate you tuning in with me. Any questions or comments, do please post them below. And if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.